After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness.
Well, good morning. So, a couple of things. One is that when I got here, a lot of people seem to notice that I don't have the big mustache anymore. Whoa, 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 whoa. And then they asked me why, and I told them because my wife threatened my life, okay? She didn't want to kiss me anymore. It was an issue. But I was also ready to move on. I've had some version of the mustache for like a year now, right? Something like that. I think it was last summer. I was tired of eating it. When I would go out to eat on Sunday, it's like in my mouth. I was tired of that. And the only other story I was going to tell, I'll give it very, very brief here. But the other week, my son, he's 6, and he's playing coach pitch baseball now. And during one practice, the coach had 2 8-year-olds. They were just siblings of kids on the team who were pretty good at baseball, and had them hit and make everyone else ground and try to get out the 8-year-olds. Of course, they're 6, and the 8-year-olds are 8. And what was really remarkable to me, and the kids had a lot of fun with it, but what was remarkable to me was how much difference there was in ability and maturity and all these things between just an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old. Have you noticed how big a difference 2 years can make? Well, I've reasoned that I am 38 now, and so the difference between me and a 40-year-old is just humongous. I mean, that would be on a whole other level. I'm nowhere close to that, okay? That is what I took from that moment. Would you guys agree? Last week, we launched into the story, and we did a lot of really good, important, setting the foundation kinds of things. We talked through creation and fall and even a little bit of Noah's Ark. And I want to give you a little bit of summary. Since we are telling this story, before we move into it today, let's at least review a touch. Last week, we kind of broke it down by the natural story elements, and so we said that there are main characters. Usually the main character in the Bible is God. But at least for the purposes of understanding the story broadly, we can say there are 2 main characters. They are God and humanity. Humanity sits at the forefront as the pinnacle of creation. God is, of course, the creator of everything. We say that every good story has a conflict, something that creates the movement that will happen through the rest of the story. In the Bible, we call that sin. Sin, which happened, of course, with the very eating that forbidden fruit, the fall of mankind in Genesis 3, created a problem that would furthermore need to be dealt with. It created a broken world, a world that is not like the perfect creation that it once was, and a world in which God and human, that relationship has been broken. They've been separated, so to speak. And the rest of the story will play out as an attempt to bring the 2 main characters back together. When we got into Noah's Ark, we discussed a theme that was beginning to develop, that's going to get a little bit further developed even today. That theme is this idea that even in a world that's broken and evil, and by the time we get to Noah's Ark, God regrets having even made humankind. That's how much sin infected it, and so quickly. But we find that it is possible for one man to actually please God and be used by Him if that man trusts and believes in God and obeys God. The first model, of course, being Noah, but we get a little bit further into this today, and we will see how some of this begins to play out. Okay, so we've got our foundational elements, but today we need to add something to this. Because not only do we have the fact that these characters are separated and that all of this will go toward bringing God and humanity back together, but we never really said how. We never got the strategy. And that's where this really becomes important. Because the answer to the strategy of how God is going to bring himself and people back together begins through building a nation. That's actually, I think, the title of chapter 2, Building a Nation. It's the idea that God is going to create this people that are his own, which we call Israel. And through this nation, God is going to reveal what he desires of humankind, who he is, his miraculous power, and his ability to defend them. He's going to introduce himself to the world again through this people, this nation, Israel. That is essentially the strategy, or at least for now. So he's going to build this nation, and most importantly, this nation has to be entirely his. It can't be divided. They can't go between different gods. They've got to believe he is the one and only God. And so in order to build that nation up, God begins with one person. And that person is the one we know as Abraham, or Father Abraham. And we are covering his story today. Side note, there are a succession of people before the nation is fully built. You may have heard these back to back before. They're grandfather, father, son, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Have you heard those three names together? Collectively, they are known as the patriarchs. It is their stories we're telling today. So all I got to do is get through all of the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob today, so no problem, right? Like 40 chapters of Genesis. We can do this, okay? You got it? So let's talk about Abraham. The first thing you need to know about Abraham is that his name is a cruel, mocking joke, okay? Abraham's original name at the beginning of the story is Abram. And Abram in Hebrew means great father. It's like buying your dad a coffee mug, except he's not your dad and he doesn't have a child. But he's got one in his office that says, greatest dad in the world, right? That's what his name is like. Furthermore, it would be like calling me too tall, right? It's a cruel, mocking joke. His name means great father. But Abram doesn't have any children, and it's really problematic for him in a whole bunch of ways that we can't even really fully explain. The fact that he has no children is incongruous with his name itself. It's incongruous with his status, as by the end of the story, he's a fairly wealthy man with a lot of land who wants to give it to someone, wants to have someone inherit his estate. It doesn't fit his status, and it doesn't really fit God's promise to him. And that's what really matters. And so this man with this cruel, mocking name is supposed to believe God's promise without seeing the result. And that is the really incredible part about his story. Even today, if you by chance went through a season like this, or you know someone who did, couples who want so much to love and pass along what they have and who they are to a child, if they are unable to have that child, it can be really heartbreaking. Couples really struggle with these things. But now you take it back to an even older time when it was even more important, and someone whose name means, hey, best dad in the world. And you can see how heartbreaking and troubling it becomes. But I said that it didn't fit the promise God gave him. So let's read that promise. We're going to open up in Genesis chapter 12. If you're trying to break down Genesis in your head, 1 through 11 pretty much covers all those opening stories, everything from creation up to the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, all of that. And then chapter 12, it kind of takes on a different mood and a different flavor. Because at this point, we now launch into the story of Abram. And it's really, really an interesting story. Okay. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 says this. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." In other words, I want you to leave everything you know and go somewhere else. And he's not even told exactly where that's going to be. This is a remarkable step. To believe that there is one God who can bless him in this sense. His family didn't believe this. He is the first of his kind. There is nothing like it. Verse 2, he makes this promise, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." In other words, you have a profound destiny. From you will become a line of people very, very important to the God of the universe. From you will be numerous people and a nation itself that God will use to do incredible things. Abraham, if you trust me, if you believe me, you have a destiny. Then we jump forward a couple chapters, and because there's multiple places where God reassures him of this promise, and poetically and narratively, it's nice to kind of bring them together. So chapter 15, in this particular account, it says, which actually God, just so you know, God took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." What's that mean? It means you are going to be incredibly blessed. A lot of people are going to come from you. You have an heir of destiny. Someday you will be known as Great Father Abraham. And he is taken aback. He trusts God. He goes and he follows him and he does these things. It's a really remarkable moment. Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. Here's something that you might want to know. As you're reading in the New Testament, you'll find the arguments of a guy named Paul, the Apostle Paul. And he is trying to argue for why Jesus changed everything. And one of the things he goes back to argue to Jews who followed the Old Testament is this very verse, because it becomes a foundational point to him. He says, you want to understand that the law was not meant to save us, then you need to know that prior to the law ever existing, there was this guy named Abraham, and he was put into right standing with God based simply on faith alone. He believed and trusted him. And that then becomes the model whereby faith and trust and action in it becomes our understanding of why we in Christ are saved by faith and not our own good works. It's a really key passage for the arguments of Paul in the New Testament. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but I wanted you to see that. Also, you recall the theme we set up in Noah, being that one person could please God if they believed and trusted? I'd like to reword that now. One person can please God if they have faith, like the faith of Father Abraham. So Abraham believes him, and he goes off to another place, and he does what he's supposed to do and follows God. But this plan of him having all these descendants like the stars in the sky does not go smoothly. If you've heard this story, you know that it's troubling. It takes a long time. Things do not go like he thinks. In fact, it takes so long that his wife, Sarai, and by the way, we haven't talked about her yet, but remember, it's painful on her as well. In her culture, to not have a child is really, really troubling. And it takes away from who she is as a woman and her very purpose as she may even understand it. But she has trouble with it. And so she makes this suggestion to Abraham and suggests that he sort of hurry up God's plan and gives him a servant girl to have a child through. Now, this servant girl, her name was Hagar, and the son he eventually had was named Ishmael. I can tell you the Bible does not describe this as a good decision. It leads to a lot of problems, a lot of hurt feelings. It leads to disagreements in the household. It's just ugly to begin with. And this Ishmael is not going to be the child of promise. It's not the one God promised. And I want to mention that to you because I do think that sometimes we believe God's promise, but we want to hurry it up and get it here quicker. Have any of you ever wanted to speed God up a little bit? I say this because I do think this matters. I think we have a tendency in our life to always be looking ahead and trying to get there quicker. And Abraham is a good example of someone who took a long time to get there, okay? I don't know if you're a young person and you really, really want to date and get married, and you find someone who is willing to go out with you, but there's all these red flags, right? Just red flags everywhere to say this might not be the right person. But if you're in a hurry, what do? You ignore it, and you make mistakes because you tried to hurry up and speed God's plan. The same thing can happen with a career. It can happen with buying a house before you're actually ready to buy a house, having a kid before you're ready to actually have a kid. It can happen in so many ways in life that you think and know and believe this is your destiny, but when you hurry it up, it all ends up in heartache and grief and more difficult for everyone. Am I right? Now, honestly, that's a little bit of an aside, but I felt like I needed to say that, okay? Now, Abraham has tried to speed up God. It was a bad decision. And things are more difficult because of it. But ultimately, God does reassure him. He gives him one last promise and says, hey, you are going to get that son. And at that point, he takes Abram and he renames him Abraham. Now, this also is a Hebrew meaning. It's slightly different. Abram means great father. Abraham means father of many nations. I wonder if Abraham was like, really, God? There's one bad enough to be named Abram. Now you're going to name me Abraham. I still have no kids except the one that you've rejected, to being the child of promise, I mean. And now you're calling me father of many nations. What are you doing, God? Well, as he reassures him, then finally these three visitors show up. Abraham is like 99 years old, by the way. And these angels show up. So we are now jumping down to chapter 18. The three angels, mysterious strangers, they don't know that they're angels. These three strangers show up. And they say to Abraham, where is your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he said. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Okay. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old. Now, by the way, if the Bible calls you old, you're pretty old, okay? I don't know if you've ever read about some of these characters in the Bible, but they live a long time. So if you're old in the Bible, you're old. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. And so Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? The way the story is described, it almost seems like her initial laughter is a little bit incredulous, almost a disbelieving laugh. Like, aha, right, I'm going to have a child next year. Sure, whatever you say. And so it's sort of pointed out that, does she trust God? And then ultimately, of course, a year later, they come back and she has had this child. And they name him Isaac. And by the way, in all these stories, names mean everything. And does anyone want to know what Isaac means? Laughter. It's beautiful, it's funny, and it's a lovely way of bringing the story together. And now Abraham really is a father. Maybe not a nation yet, but he's well on his way. And although it took 99 years to get there, it seems that God's promises are happening, that his faith has been rewarded and paid off. And you might think that the story is over here, as finally we have this great lesson of a saint who believed God and became the foundation of the nation he was going to build because he trusted God and ultimately received the promise miraculously at an old age. Amen, end of story. Let's move on, right? Except you may know that remember what we said about how this nation had to be entirely God's and not Abraham's? There's one more part of the story that has become very famous, very well known, and incredibly important. And so God decides to put Abraham through one last test. So let's see where we are. We are now down to chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. I love how it tells you up front, it's a test. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And then God said, take your son, your only son, by the way, whom you love, that one, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now, let me be clear. God never in the Old Testament or the New Testament or anywhere ever asks for actual child sacrifice. We are told up front that this is a test. And the reason is that God needs to know that this, as the foundation block on which he is building his nation, he needs to know that Abraham truly trusts him with everything, because faith, as much as Abraham, is the foundation of this nation that they are building, and this plan and strategy for bringing all of humanity together. If this fails, everything else fails. He's got to get it right. And so he gives him this test and makes sure that truly Abraham gets it. Now, Abraham, we're not given a lot of his psychology through it, right? He agrees, apparently, and he takes Isaac, and they head off into the mountains. And there's even this really sad moment where Isaac, you imagine this little boy, we don't know exactly how old he was, carrying the sticks, and he looks at his father, and he says, Father Abraham, all the things are here for the sacrifice, but where is the ram or the animal that's going to be sacrificed? And Abraham has to say, well, God will provide it. They continue up the mountain, and we get a little bit of of the psychology actually out of the book of Hebrews. Hebrews has a famous chapter that recounts all the heroes of, the key word being faith, all the heroes of faith. Abraham being one of those. And if you were reading the story, chapter 2 this week, you may have noticed that a great deal of how they told this story, he actually pulled out of the book of Hebrews, not out of the book of Genesis. Because Hebrews does a good job of recounting this story. And in that, we do get a little bit of psychology as to what Abraham might have been thinking. Hebrews chapter 11. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. What happens is he goes up there on the mountain, he picks the knife up, he's ready to plunge it in, and an angel cries out, "Stop!" In this very dramatic moment, God stops him from doing it. And then God realizes that Abraham truly does trust him. And Abraham can become this foundational block that will build the nation that is part of the strategy to bring all of humanity back to God. And so they take Isaac off of the altar. God provides a ram that's found in the bushes to be the actual sacrifice. They switch it out, and they try to, and they make things right. There's a number of really interesting things about this, right? For one, that mountain where Abraham almost sacrificed his son. Many scholars believe that Mount Moriah ultimately becomes the Temple Mount in which the temple in Jerusalem was built. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because this near sacrifice becomes the place in which all the sacrifices of Israel would later take place. It's important because in this moment we get the idea that sacrifices have this ability. But ultimately, it was not Abraham's sacrifice that mattered, it was what God provided. In that very day, it says that God, or Abraham, renamed the place Peniel, meaning God will provide. And if I were to put in my own little explanation in brackets, I'd put God will provide the sacrifice. Because that's what we're talking about, right? Now, you can't help but draw a conclusion that there is some foreshadowing going on in this story. Because ultimately, the ultimate sacrificial provision by God is not a lamb or a ram found in the bushes, but what? I didn't hear that. His son. God will provide for the sacrifice. Ultimately, the only person who was ever really going to sacrifice their own son was not Abraham, but God himself. There's a foreshadowing. That's why it's such an incredible story. And so you hear this, and you see God telling him not to sacrifice Abraham's son, but God will someday sacrifice his own son. And all of these things come together, and we know that Peniel, the place where God provides the sacrifice, is an important and profound place. And now is secure the theme of how faith is incredible, how God provides the sacrifices, the characters coming together, the building block of the nation that's going to come from all this, being trusted on with faith itself. All those things are in place. And now, finally, the story of Abraham is essentially ended. Remember I told you we have to get through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob today? We're not going to do much of Isaac. Isaac's story is really short. He's not really a main character. He just kind of shows up in the other two. But I am going to spend some time on Jacob's story, because this also is very important. And just as in Abraham, the story of Jacob is all about the name. Remember how Abram's name was a bit of a cruel mockery, like too tall for me? Well, Jacob's name is very meaningful as well. Jacob is born with a twin brother named Esau. And in the womb, the story is that they were wrestling for who would come out first, which is very indicative of the struggle that they're going to have the rest of their life. And so when Jacob comes out, they name him Jacob, which means he grasps the heel of, which is sort of a literal description of what was going on at the birth. But even more than that, it's Hebrew idiom. In the Hebrew idiom, the idea of he grasps the heel of means that this is someone who fights and wrestles and lives in enmity with everyone. Someone who just does not get along. Someone who wrestles, and in particular, especially through manipulation and trickery. And so this name tells us an unfortunate amount of what we need to know about Jacob early in his life. He's a trickster. He's manipulative. He lives in enmity with others. He tends to create these boundaries. He has these problems getting along. The kindergarten teacher would say he does not play well with others. Jacob, his name means a lot. And what's really fascinating is to watch all of this take place, because Jacob's name does come to fruition at least a couple of times. Now, just so you understand, you have Jacob, who is, the nice description is he's indoorsy, okay? He is his mom's favorite. He spends most of the time in the house or in the kitchen helping her, and His brother, on the other hand, Esau, who actually is the oldest, and therefore would seemingly be the one that would ultimately be the child of promise like Isaac was. Except remember, it's got to be God's nation, not ours. Esau is described as extremely hairy, which could be funny. But more than that, he's outdoorsy, he's a hunter, and he's his dad's favorite. And so you've got these two opposite brothers who don't complement each other at all, and they're always at odds. And seemingly time and time again, Jacob gets the upper hand. And so, for instance, one day Esau comes in from hunting, and Jacob is there, and Esau is talking about how hungry and famished he is, and Jacob offers to make him a bowl of stew in exchange for his birthright as the oldest son. Now, birthright as the oldest son doesn't mean a whole lot to us. In their day and age, it meant a lot. It meant that you got twice the inheritance of the other children, and at least in this case, you would also come with the promises of being God's chosen for building up this nation. It's a big deal. And for whatever reason, Esau doesn't seem to care. He just gives him the birthright in exchange for this stew. I've racked my head trying to understand Esau's thinking, and I don't know that it's actually there, but I do have a couple of ideas. Maybe Esau doesn't believe that it'll ever actually be enforced. Sure, you can be the oldest son. Just now let me have this stew. After all, whose child is he the favorite of? Which parent? The dad. Meaning dad can probably undo and fix this, right? I'll never actually be held accountable to it. That's one thought I've had. The other is that maybe he's not stupid, but maybe he is driven so much by his own appetites and his own passions that he really doesn't have the self-control that would be needed to be one of God's chosen. Maybe he's just driven by what's directly in front of him. You know anyone like that? I don't know. But for whatever reason, he doesn't respect the birth order blessing enough, and Jacob takes it. But to be fair, Jacob's a bit of a manipulator. Later on, it happens again. This time, Isaac, being an old man now, this would be the father of Jacob and Esau, being an old man is almost completely blind, and he knows his day of death is coming, and it's his responsibility to grant a blessing that would formalize and finalize the birth order and who gets the inheritance and all this or that. And so he tells the son that he wants to have everything, that is Esau, to go out and hunt and bring him back a meal, and then that will be the time when the formal blessing will be released. And this one is actually more so the mother's idea. But she and Jacob work together to come up with a plot to kind of fix it. I don't have time to tell you the whole story. I wish I did. If that was the only thing I was preaching today, we'd really get into it. But if you want to go back and read this story, you absolutely should. It's hilarious, honestly. And it's a really interesting story. But they decide to concoct this plan to trick their father. And so, because Esau is described as so hairy, they're putting like goat skins on his arms. Because remember, Isaac is blind at this point, to trick him. Now, I do wonder to myself, how hairy was he that they had goat skins on his arms? Like, that's unbelievable, right? And he puts on his brother's clothes so that he smells like his brother, and then he goes in and he pretends to be his brother and tricks a blind man. Not exactly the hero of the faith you were hoping for, right? But this is what they do. And so he goes in and he tricks Isaac, and Isaac gives him the actual blessing that finalizes it. And now he is fully and completely stolen the birthright and the blessing. And now he is going to be the one upon which the nation of God is built. Final. It cannot be changed at this point. This trickster, this guy who lives in enmity, this guy who manipulates, is now being used for this important role. And it's not great. Now, of course, when his brother gets back, there's a blow up, and all of a sudden, it is near death blows. His life is in danger, and so they quickly run Jacob off to live somewhere else, and he goes to stay with family far away, his mother's family, by the way. And he stays with an uncle named Laban. And there, in this faraway country, he lives for many, many years, and a lot of things happen. For one, he finds out the roots of his manipulative ways on his mother's side. He finds out that he came by all this very honestly, and he gets a taste of his own medicine. His uncle Laban tricks him into marrying not one but both of his daughters. But in the end, he develops a family, develops two wives. He gets animals, and starts to pick up wealth, and eventually God turns things around that are going well for him. He then sneaks out under very suspect circumstances and flees the scene in order to avoid any more conflict. So here is the guy whose name literally means lives in enmity with everyone, once again fleeing. But there's a problem. If he wants to go home, who's he got to face when he gets there? His brother Esau, who last we checked wanted to kill him. So he's understandably very afraid. And as he's taking his family down the road or the path back home, he sends people ahead to scout out where they're going, and one of them comes back and informs him of some terrible news. Your brother Esau has discovered you coming, and he's on his way to meet you, and by the way, he's bringing with him 400 men. Would you take that as a threat if you heard that report? I would. So Jacob is scared. Finally, what his name and who he has become is going to finally give him consequences. His brother is going to come and wipe out everything that he has, and there's no chance that he can fight him. It's just not going to work. And so he makes all the conniving little preparations he can make. He starts sending gifts ahead, and he starts dividing his family up so they can only kill one camp and not the other. And he makes all these plans. And finally, after he's done all these things, he has nothing left to do but to sit down on the side of the Jabbok River and do something he doesn't normally do. He prays. And what happens after that is bizarre and kind of hard to explain, and yet incredibly meaningful. In what seems almost like a dream sequence, he's sitting there on the Jabbok River praying, and all of a sudden, this stranger shows up and begins wrestling him at night. And they go back and forth, and all that pain, and all that enmity, and all that anger, and all that dissatisfaction and frustration just sort of seems to boil up inside of Jacob, and he's just putting everything into fighting this one man right now because he's the guy in front of him. And he's frustrated. It's all coming out, and it's going back and forth, and it lasts for hours. And finally, they get to sort of a neutral, position that no one can really get any further ahead, and it seems to stop, but Jacob is just holding on, and he won't let go. And it seems like out of nowhere, all of a sudden, the voice of God begins to speak. If we're following along, it's Genesis 32. The man that he was wrestling answers him. The man asked him, "What is your name?" Remember, names mean everything in Genesis. "Jacob," he answered. "That's right. I'm the fighter. I'm the guy that lives an enemy of everyone. I'm the guy who pushes back. I'm the guy that wins this. My name's Jacob." And then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob." But what is that? Israel. You mean the nation that God is building as the strategy to win humankind back? That Israel? Named after this moment? Israel in Hebrew, which means he doesn't wrestle with human beings like Jacob does, but he wrestles with God. That's what Israel means. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled, wrestled with God and with humans, and have overcome. And all of a sudden, this takes on a whole new meaning. His name is changed because it never really was about wrestling with people. It was always and always had been about wrestling with God himself. That's who he'd been wrestling all his life. Did I have another couple of verses? Yeah, I did. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name. I don't know who you are. Tell me who you are. You're not my brother. You didn't sneak up on me at night. Who are you?" But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. And Jacob has a realization. You see it in this next part. And Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Jacob makes the realization that he was always battling God. Peniel means face of God. And it's a really beautiful moment. Okay. In this moment, a lot of things change. Jacob's life has changed. He's now Israel. And keep in mind that what we thought was the main challenge of the story still hasn't been taken care of. He still has to wake up from this all-night wrestling match and go deal with his brother. But what's really funny and ironic and strange about it is his brother was coming on friendly terms and wanted to greet him and hug him and say how much he missed him. Confirmation that his battle was never really with people, but always with God. And now and forevermore, the people that choose to hang in there and wrestle with the God of the universe, who choose to go back and forth with him about their own sin, who choose to give in to him, all those people are now known as Israel because they are the nation of God. Not based on their nationality, but on their faith and on their ability and willingness to wrestle with God. It's really a fascinating story and a fascinating moment. Names mean everything. So let me finish this up with a little summary, right? Last week we were talking about the main characters are God and humanity. We talked about the conflict being sin and the separation of God and humanity. We talked about themes, which you've now described as faith, the ability to please God in a broken world by simply believing him, which we saw in Noah and then in Abraham. And now, finally, we add to it strategy, the idea that God is going to build this nation of people. And what's amazing is that neither Abraham nor Jacob is a perfect piece. They're not even really great people, if you read it. They make a lot of mistakes along the way. Jacob is himself someone who battles with people nearly all of his life. Neither of them comes out squeaky clean. But both of them do come to believe. And that seems to make all the difference in the world. So even as you make mistakes, faith and believing and choosing to hang in there and wrestle is what allows God to use you in his story. See, what's weird is God can be accepted, he can be rejected, he can be pushed away, but the one thing he will not be is ignored. Jacob doesn't ignore him. From here on, God's got his attention. And from here, God can begin to build the nation. At this point, we stop doing individuals, and from here on, all 12 of Israel's kids go on to build their own lines, and hence the 12 tribes, right? And so from here on, this is the foundational piece. All of his children will be part of the promise and become the 12 tribes, hence the name Israel. Last week, I forgot to do application points. Let me do that real quick. We are doing one chapter of the story every week, so if you're following along, you can read chapter 3 before we come together next Sunday. That's the easiest one to do. You can also read the associated chapters in the Bible. Number 2, and this is kind of important, going on the idea of these names, I want you to trust God with a sore spot in your life, okay? Here's what I mean by that. Abraham's sore spot was the fact that he didn't have any kids, even though his name was Great Father. It was just sort of this incongruity that just bugged him all of his life. Jacob's problem is that he battles with everyone and manipulates them and then runs away. And both of them learn to trust God in their sore spots and be recreated as something else. Now, I don't know what your sore spot is. I don't know what it is about yourself that you can't stand, or that thing about you that doesn't make sense, that always bugs you. It's always sitting there in the back of your mind. Why am I like this? Why am I not? I've never been the smartest guy in class, and when people call on me, I never know what to say, and I'm so frustrated by that, and that's your sore spot. Or, you know what? I've never been as good looking as other people, and I've never been able to have successful relationships, or you know what, I'm the only one in my friend group that went through a divorce, or whatever it is. What's your sore spot? What's the name that you were given that's kind of cruel? Trust God with it. Because even though that may feel like something about you that you hate, it is in your weaknesses in which God is most active. And he was doing that way long ago. And he continues to do it today. Yes, I always struggled with being too introverted, and now look at me. Whatever it is, your sore spot, God can turn it around. Use it for his good and make you part of his story, to where his story and your story fit together. And that's what we call biblical faith. So if you will, bow your heads. God in heaven, I pray that as we go through the story, you will draw our hearts and minds more to you, that we'll understand the flow of history so that we can anticipate what you want to do and get minds and eyes that see and think like you. Lord, I pray that you work in every one of our hearts, that we might be drawn closer and closer to you in all things. Lord, we love you and we give you your due. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.